Hello and welcome to Practical Christian Lessons. I am Joshua Pearsall and we are finally in sweater weather. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here today. We are going to actually be talking, we have been going through a series examining the biblical narrative and comparing it to some of the ancient Near East stories and mythoses that were around it, to sort of demonstrate how, despite what some scholars will claim, other scholars will point out, such as John Oswalt, and a long tradition about 80 years ago prior, for a very long time, pointing this out, that the differences in the Old Testament were so stark, it didn't make sense to just claim it was a development of the other theology. It was so starkly different from what was around it. But about 60, 80 years ago, I think about 80 years ago now, the scholarship sort of changed its mindset and started focusing more on the similarities, saying that this was, in fact, the Old Testament theology was just a development. That, all the deities, all the people around them had a primary deity. Yahweh just excluded the others. Or, not Yahweh. The Hebrews and the Israelites just excluded the others. But that's not quite the same. And we'll go through that a lot throughout the series. Today is going to be slightly different. This is an essay on what's known as the documentary hypothesis. And I think it's just worth reading this. It is the cover image and the thumbnail as well, if you've wondered what it is. We've also got a slightly new mic setup, so if this is too loud, it's too boomy, please let me know. I think last week's was a little loud for me personally, so I've gone back in and changed a few settings. Hopefully that helps out here. But to this essay. This is on page 15, if you have the specific archaeological study Bible here. Until Genesis 7. Until fairly recently, a majority of scholars espoused the documentary hypothesis. Of note, a long time the hypothesis didn't exist. It came into existence. A lot of skeptical scholarship accepted it. And present day, back to this essay. To explain the composition of the Pentateuch and the first 5 Old Testament books. This theory asserts that these writings were actually based on 4 books, none still extant, referred to for ease of identification as J, Yahwehist or Jahwist, E, Elohist, D, Deuteronomist, and P, priestly code. The main argument for this theory are the existence of repetition and apparent contradictions within these 5 books, as well as the use of different names for God. I'd like to point out they're apparent, they're not actually contradictions. If you want to address contradictions in the Bible, I actually recommend Aspiring Philosophy and a channel called Testify. They both have a series of videos, I believe, addressing many supposed contradictions. According to this hypothesis, J, the oldest document, included large portions of Genesis, passages from Exodus and Numbers, and a few short texts from Deuteronomy. In Genesis, J referred to God as Yahweh, the Lord, because the biblical author believed that people began using the name Yahweh early in human history. And then it has a note about seeing Genesis 4:26 there. E, written somewhat later, followed the same storyline as J. In Genesis, E referred to God as Elohim, the more generic God, rather than as Yahweh, because according to adherents of E, the name Yahweh was not revealed until the Exodus period. See Exodus 3:15. I'll have a little note there as well if you have this Bible. D was essentially the book of Deuteronomy. 2 Kings records that Hilkiah, the priest, located a copy of the law of Moses when the Jerusalem temple was being restored. According to the documentary hypothesis, however, Deuteronomy was drafted at this time as a pious fraud to justify Josiah's reformation. So they literally just say that the account we have from Josiah is wrong. And this is what actually happened. So take that into account when evaluating their judgment. P was written during the post-exilic period, following the return from the exile, including large portions of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. In Genesis, P referred to God as Elohim, since, like E, its authors assumed that the divine name Yahweh was first revealed at the time of the Exodus. See Exodus 6:3 and its note on the P text. According to this theory, the 4 documents were composed independently of one another, but were, over a prolonged period of time, compiled and edited into the present Pentateuch, with much of the original E material deleted. Still, they argued, the Pentateuch retains significant redundancy and contradiction because the 4 documents often tell the same or similar stories with inconsistent details. Thus, for example, Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a was identified as the P account of creation, while the rest of Genesis 2 was seen as a throwback to the earlier J rendition. It's worth noting for a lot of the scholarship, particularly buying into these theories, they are hyper skeptics most of the time. As noted here, they'll make arguments about how we can't trust the Bible and can only trust it when outside sources collaborate it, but when the only historical document we have is the Bible, instead of trusting it as an historical document, because it is, they will do two things. As it was noted here, they simply said that the account of King Josiah was a lie, and that this was made up to justify what had happened in the Second Kings account. It's Kings 22 or it's 23, where you find Josiah's story there. And rather than taking it as Josiah found the book of the law of Moses, believed to be Deuteronomy by many scholars, and from there realized what had happened, and then corrected how far Israel had fallen, they say, no, Josiah actually just revised all of the theology. That's one of the arguments. There's many different ones. And then the other important thing here, right, they're skeptical of it is a history text because of how history was written, but they're not that same level of skeptical with other historical texts. And a lot of the people in the modern day especially who aren't, it happens with plenty of atheist scholars too, look at Daniel Cullen, but other atheists as well, and agnostics who look at the Old Testament text and then don't understand how history was written in the ancient world. They didn't write history like we do in our time, where we're very specific. We want everything to be as 100% accurate as possible. They weren't necessarily as concerned with that. They were fine changing a few details to make it a theological point or some kind of other point. Not that they weren't lying. This was the accepted model of history, and they weren't changing things to change the story that had happened, but they may highlight or de-emphasize certain details or add certain terms to make a specific point. And there's plenty of scholars who do tons of work on that. Just look into people who write on how history in the ancient world worked. In refuting these arguments, it is helpful to recognize that repetition was an essential part of ancient Near Eastern narrative. Storytellers often repeated details 2 or more times, sometimes from a different perspective or with differing details, and narrators often recounted parallel stories. Cross-reference the 3 instances of a patriarch passing off his wife as a sister, Abraham in chapters 12 and 20, and Isaac in chapter 26. For a much later example, see the accounts of Paul's conversion in Acts 9, 22, and 26. And if you happen to have time, go read 1 John. And if you think you can just keep mentally track of it, just take like colored highlighters or something and color like the words light from the beginning, things like that, and see how he just keeps repeating himself and then adding on a little bit each time. That was John's favorite writing style. This was just a very common ancient writing style. In an ancient narrative, repetition was viewed not as evidence of multiple authorship, but as confirmation of a single author. The argument about the names Yahweh and Elohim may be based on a misunderstanding of certain passages, such as Exodus 6, 2-3. This passage appears in the NIV as, I am the Lord, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. This rendering makes it sound, in line with the P portion of the documentary hypothesis, as though the patriarchs did not know the name Yahweh, the Lord, thus allowing such scholars to attribute to the J the passages in Genesis referring to Yahweh. But the text may alternatively be translated, I am the Lord, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. And my name is the Lord. Did I not make myself known to them? Rendered in this way, these verses do not assert that Abraham had never heard of the Lord. Many scholars today have abandoned the documentary hypothesis, agreeing that it is based on a faulty understanding of ancient Near Eastern literature and that it contributes nothing helpful to our understanding of the Pentateuch. And I can confirm that, especially in Europe, it started kind of dying off first. I think it was in Europe, maybe it was here in America, and now it started dying off over there. Or maybe it's the other way around. I read too many books. I can't keep up with all these things. And there's so much that I could talk about here with the documentary hypothesis. I have a lot of problems with this theory, but it's also worth noting that for a lot of, including very conservative Orthodox Christian scholarship, it is noted that there were editors. Right? Moses didn't give us the entire Torah because he didn't write in the words. Then Moses died. Moses was dead when that was written. But we do agree he did give us the fundamental portions of the Torah that later became edited, translated, and put into what we now have. So there were editors that came in after the fact, but they weren't revising, like in the sense of revisionism. They weren't changing what was there. They were editing. They were adding in notes of like, this was once called X, or this is now called Y. Things like that. In another clear example, Moses probably didn't write in, "He was the most humble man." I'm just going to make that assumption there. I think it's a pretty safe assumption. So we're not just like out here saying Moses wrote down all of the entire Torah and then handed it off, and it was handed off, and it was handed off. That's not what a lot of... I don't really know much of any serious scholarship that actually tries to make such ridiculous claims. But we're noting there was an editing process, and it was preserved orally. It was written. We know from the Exodus account itself that at least some of the text was written down, because there are parts of it where it says, "and it was written down" at that time. But these were also oral cultures, so they preserved oral history a lot longer. They had a lot better memories. They recited these as stories, and that's one important thing for understanding these. And that's why repetition was also one of the very common things. Not everyone could read. Not everyone had the tools with which to write, because it was not easy to write in the ancient world. And when people could, it was normally quite costly. So the easiest thing to do was get people to memorize it. And there were two very easy tools to help people memorize it. And you'll see this in the Gospels as well. Inspiring Philosophy actually had a really great video recently. I was very happy with it, on looking at the Gospels. And he was talking about how they were story and narrative. And narrative, repetition, and we'll add in third, poetry, are all three big tools that help you memorize text. And that's how the Bible's written. It's a lot more obvious if you can read Hebrew. And I don't mean read Hebrew as in understand the words. If you can pronounce the Hebrew when you see it, like I can do with Greek. I'm able to read the words in Greek and say what the words are, even if I don't necessarily know what they all are. I'm still learning Greek. But when you do that, you can see a lot of repetition and a lot of how the sentences are structured. There's plays on words, things that just don't come across the same in English. And there's things that just won't translate well into the English. We'll talk about that in other videos as well. So just some interesting thoughts to keep around. The documentary hypothesis has rightly started to die out, and has been dying out for some time. It was dying out when this was written. It's only in over here. It's only increased since then. I don't know much other than people who were holding to it and just won't let go, that are still holding on to it. These are the same types of people who also, their justification for dating things like the Gospels to after 70, all four of them, is that it predicted the destruction of the temple. Therefore, it couldn't have been written past 70. The problem with that is your conclusion is leading the evidence, because that only makes sense if you're presupposing that naturalism, there is no divine intercession into the world, there's no divine action, there's no supernatural events. If that's true, then yeah, you can't date them before 70. Theoretically, you still could. They could have just predicted it or guessed, even if you weren't a naturalist. They're a little too specific to be guesses. But because they just reject the supernatural and God's divine action in the world, they say that these texts must be dated later. They do the same thing with Daniel and tons of other prophetic texts. That's an aside, but that's also worth keeping in mind. For a lot of the scholarship in JEPD stuff, these people are so skeptical that it is an unreasonable level of skepticism, and it blinds them when they approach these things. And there is level-headed scholarship that does look at JEPD and come to more moderate versions that have, some of them have just changed names and have adopted different theories that were sort of like modified versions of what they were holding. JEPD is not that big a deal. But for some reason it was for a long time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go before I continue to ramble on about pointless things. You guys have a wonderful day, and God bless.